Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Catholicism. I am here with Ethan Muse, and we've got Dale from Real Seekers. That's his YouTube channel. And today we are debating the Eucharistic Miracle of Lanciano. And this is going to be, I think, a very fruitful dialogue, as you'll see throughout this debate. What we've got for you guys is we're going to do 20-minute opening statements, starting with Ethan. Then we're going to follow that up with open dialogue for about an hour, maybe a little over an hour. And then we're going to turn to Q&A after that through super chats or any questions that you guys send in. We'll get to those at the very end of this stream. And we've got something special planned for this one as well. We're going to do an after show. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit, but let's go ahead and get right into it. Let's start with Ethan's opening statement. Ethan, when you start, I will start my timer.
Cool. Okay. For centuries, the Lanciano relics have been venerated as the remains of a Eucharistic miracle that is reputed to have involved a doubting priest witnessing the consecrated elements perceptibly transformed during Mass. In this debate, I will argue that the best explanation for the origination and preservation of the Lanciano relics is divine vindication of the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. Since my opponent forewarned me that he intends to propose a variety of alternative explanations, I will try to present the case for authenticity as comprehensively as I can. However, given that I only have 20 minutes, I will neither be able to explain the data as thoroughly as I would like to, nor to address every objection that has been raised by skeptics. I would encourage anyone that wants to learn more about the Lanciano relics to check out my Substack, Motiva Credibilitatis. My case for authenticity of the relics will proceed in the following stages. First, I will argue that the scientific examinations done by Dr. Winoli have conclusively demonstrated that the relics are human cardiac tissue and human blood clots. Second, I will argue that it is historically certain that the Lanciano relics existed in their current form by no later than the High Middle Ages. Third, I will argue that the origination and preservation of the relics can't be explained naturalistically, since the data precludes both pre-modern and modern fraud. Fourth, I will briefly consider and then refute the hypothesis that the best explanation for the origination and preservation of the relics involves demons. And finally, I will argue that on the supposition that the origination and preservation were miraculous, they were intended to vindicate transubstantiation. So now I'm going to begin with identification. In 1970, when the Archbishop of Lanciano authorized a scientific examination of the Lanciano relics, Italian scientist Odardo Linoli was permitted to extract samples from the relics. Dr. Ranoli was the head of the Laboratory of Clinical Analysis and Pathological Anatomy at the Hospital of Arezzo in Tuscany. He was also a full professor of anatomy, histology, chemistry, and clinical microscopy. After a thorough investigation, he concluded that the relics were human cardiac tissue and human blood clots. Furthermore, he solicited a second opinion from atheist Dr. Ruggero Bertelli, a professor of human anatomy at the University of Siena, one of Italy's top secular universities. Dr. Bertelli concurred with Dr. Ranoli's interpretation of his histological slides. In 1971, Dr. Ranoli published his results, including photomicrographs, in a scholarly journal. In 1981, Dr. Ranoli carried out a supplemental investigation on a leftover fragment. The results of the follow-up study were even more conclusive than the original results, since the newly examined fragment possessed evidentially significant features that had not been apparent in the fragment that Dr. Ranoli had previously examined during his investigation in 1970. Now, there are 6 converging lines of evidence that support Dr. Ranoli's identification of the relics. Gross anatomy. Macroscopically, the flesh is a circular disc. The combination of a rounded perimeter and concentric void indicates that it's from a hollow organ. Progressive thinning towards the center indicates that it's a laminar section that's oriented tangentially to the surface of an ellipsoid, so of an ellipsoidal hollow organ. The diameter of the flesh is approximately 55 millimeters, which is fully consistent with the dimensions of the left ventricle of the heart of an adult human male. A discrete localized protrusion extends into the central void and remains continuous with the surrounding mass. That's suggestive of the heart, which has that kind of relief. Histology. Microscopically, Dr. Ranoli determined the flesh possessed the characterizing features of myocardium. Dr. Bertelli confirmed, quote, examination of the slides has led me to conclude that the microscopic structures contained therein consist of striated muscle tissue. Although the nuclei and transverse striations of the histological elements are not visible in the preparations, the particular arrangement of these elements, which are juxtaposed and grouped together to form small columns, supports this diagnosis. The orientation of the muscle bundles, which intersect across different planes and in various directions, together with the presence of anisotomatic connections between individual fibers, orients the diagnosis towards myocardial muscle tissue. Immunology. Dr. Ranoli performed a species identification test on both the flesh and the blood. He used commercial, forensic-grade, anti-human serum from a reputable supplier and ran the reaction in parallel with controls, rabbit, bovine, and saline. The results were unambiguous. Both the flesh and the blood produced a clear precipitin band in about 5 minutes with human anti-serum, while no reaction appeared in the animal or saline controls. In the forensic literature, the combination of a rapid strong positive in the target antiserum and complete negativity in controls is considered to be definitive proof of a true homologous match. The cardiologist Dr. Franco Serafini declared the human origin of the Lanciano relics is, quote, qualitatively unquestionable, end quote. Blood grouping. Dr. Ranoli performed the absorption elution test on both the flesh and the blood. Both reacted with anti-A and anti-B antisera, indicating that both belonged to blood group AB. Ranoli included substrate controls made from blotting paper that had never come into contact with the samples, which produced no agglutination. Regarding the possibility of microbial contamination, he concluded, quote, the hypothesis that microorganisms are the origin of the A and B antigens is completely inconsistent. The miraculous heart had few colonies on its surface and not in the peripheral area from which the small fragment was taken. Numerous histological preparations have never demonstrated parasites which readily appear under basic staining, end quote. In 1991, Dr. Ranoli's AB result was independently reproduced by the University of Siena. Chromatography. Dr. Ranoli performed thin layer chromatography on an alkaline extract of the blood. In triplicate runs, the migration of the extract was perfectly aligned with hemotin standards, demonstrating the presence of heme-derived compounds in the sample. Teichmann and Takayama tests came back negative, indicating that the hemoglobin was too degraded to produce crystals. However, as Dr. Ranoli pointed out, degraded hemoglobin is decisive evidence of genuine blood. Dr. Ranoli wrote, quote, the chromatographic test on paper has full value for the recognition of blood, even in severely damaged materials, which no longer provide the reactions of hemoglobin. This study thus confirms the true hemetic nature of the ancient blood of Lanciano. Electrophoresis. Dr. Ranoli performed blood protein electrophoresis in the blood. The electrophoretic tracing showed a regular distribution of serum protein fractions matching the profile of human blood serum. Dr. Ranoli emphasized that the sequence of protein fractions was completely regular and comparable to that of fresh serum, confirming the blood retaining the characteristics of fresh serum despite its antiquity. The proportions were consistent with the serum of humans and other primates, but not with common domestic animals. Thus, the blood protein electrophoresis results independently corroborate the true hemetic nature and species identity of the ancient blood. Furthermore, Father Nicola Nizzuti pointed out that these results are astonishing since, quote, for this test, the sample cannot normally be kept for more than 2 to 4 days at 4 degrees centigrade. Now on to the provenance of the relics. For the purposes of this debate, I don't need to prove the traditional account of the miracle is reliable. All I need to prove is that the only plausible explanation for the origination and preservation of the relics is a vindicatory miracle. Nonetheless, there's compelling evidence that the relics date back to at least the High Middle Ages. Let's work backwards from 1970. In 1970, the 1886 episcopal seals that were affixed to the reliquaries were broken in front of a large crowd of witnesses, and Dr. Ranoli was given permission to extract small fragments. The morphology, texture, coloration, and weight of the relics were found to be entirely consistent with the 1886 inspection. The 1886 episcopal seals, impressed in wax with the bishop's unique matrix, could not have been removed without leaving behind unmistakable signs of tampering. It would have been infeasible to forge replicas of the seals, since the matrix that was used to produce them was destroyed in 1895. From the 17th century until the late 19th century, the chain of custody is secure. Episcopal visitation records confirm the church was continuously exhibiting relics that had the same macroscopic appearance as the ones on display today. There was no proportionate motive for substitution, since there were neither imminent plans to subject the relics to critical scrutiny, nor any available means by which species or organ identity could be verified. Fabricating substitutes would have required procuring fresh human heart tissue and clotted blood, aging them in a way that replicated the effects of centuries of natural degradation, and tampering with reliquaries without detection. Multiple sources confirm an episcopal inspection took place in 1574. This examination was later commemorated in a marble epigraph that is visible today in the Church of San Francesco. The inscription, carved in 1636 when the relics were transferred to a new chapel, explicitly records the canonical recognition of the relics in 1574. In a chronicle written in 1620, the historian Fellow reported that 2 friars told him, quote, in 1560, 2 Basilian monks came to the convent of St. Francis. They stole from us a parchment codex written in Greek and Latin, hidden between 2 tablets, that contained a complete narration of the Eucharistic miracle. The bilingual format would have been entirely appropriate for an authentic document from the early Middle Ages, but completely unnecessary and impractical for a forger in the late Middle Ages. The earliest surviving reference to the relics dates to the 11th century. The Archbishop of Aversa recounts the story of a Eucharistic miracle in Italy in which the consecrated bread and wine perceptibly turned into flesh and blood, which were then sealed within the altar by the local bishop for perpetual veneration. Although Guitmund, the Archbishop, does not name Lanciano, the details precisely correspond to the Lanciano tradition. Now let's go to the naturalistic inexplicability of the relics. The foregoing raises the question of how the relics could have come into being at the time they did. From the standpoint of naturalism, the only plausible explanation is fraud. Let's begin by considering pre-modern fraud. A pre-modern fraud would have required procuring a heart and blood from a fresh human corpse, fashioning the heart and blood into relics, and then introducing them into Lanciano's devotional life in such a way that they were received as ancient and venerable. Pre-modern fraud is precluded by many lines of evidence. First, Dr. Ranoli pointed out that only a very skilled hand in anatomical dissection could have managed, though not without serious difficulty, to obtain from a hollow organ a uniform and continuous slice tangential to the surface. In fact, the dissection required to produce the flesh would have been practically impossible for a pre-modern forger for many reasons, including the technique. Early modern anatomical dissection was expository. Meanwhile, there was basically no anatomical dissection at all throughout the entirety of the High Middle Ages. Even if controlled tangential planing of ventricular walls had been technically feasible, it's extremely unlikely that a pre-modern forger pioneered and mastered that technique centuries before anyone else without leaving a trace. Equipment. The fraudster would have had to have maintained a sub-degree level of angular precision and depth precision throughout the entire dissection. That's actually not physically possible with freehand dissection, especially with pre-modern instruments, which are crude. Without mechanical constraints, blade orientation is governed solely by the operator's joints, and small perturbations are geometrically amplified. Fixation. The chemical fixatives required for precision sectioning of soft tissue were not invented until the 19th century, and without them, excising a uniform continuous transverse section with a tangential cut would have been practically impossible. Ventricles deform under minimal pressure. They shift, collapse, twist, and recoil. Deformations occur within the tissue itself, not at the operator-blade interface, so neither skill nor ingenuity could have avoided them. Second, the species and organ identity of the relics makes no sense for a pre-modern fraud. Procuring and dissecting a fresh human cadaver would have been unnecessarily difficult and risky. Animal flesh was easily accessible, cheap, indistinguishable from human flesh until the early 20th century. Even if a fraudster insisted on using human flesh, superficial muscle would have sufficed. The Lanciano tradition doesn't identify the flesh as heart tissue, and pre-modern audience didn't interpret it that way. If a fraudster went out of their way to perform a complex dissection on a heart, doesn't it stand to reason that the fraudster would want the fact that their fake relic was a heart to be legible to their intended audience? Moreover, the AB blood would have to be yet another independent coincidence. Third, Dr. Ranoli determined that preservatives had never been applied to the relics. It was common knowledge among everyone that flesh and blood needed to be treated, or otherwise they would decompose. After going to all the work to procure the relics, a fraudster would not have tolerated the risk of immediate putrefaction, nor would it have cost them anything in terms of credibility to apply a standard preservation technique, since that easily could have been passed off as a custodial decision. Fourth, without preservatives, even in highly favorable storage conditions, culinary meat only lasts for a few days. The situation with myocardium is even worse because it's highly cellular, water-rich, and metabolically fragile. Meanwhile, coagulated blood clots are among the least stable biological materials on the planet. Blood clots are fragile. They're hydration-dependent fibrin networks rather than structurally stable tissues. So it's not clear how, even if you use preservatives, that short-term preservation of multiple freestanding coagulated masses would have been possible at all. Fifth, long-term preservation of soft tissue requires continuous suppression of water activity, microbial growth, and oxygen exposure. Egyptian mummies, for instance, tend to be well preserved because they were embalmed and then sealed away from air and humidity. By contrast, in addition to never having been treated with preservatives, the Lanciano relics were exposed for centuries in liturgical vessels that were neither airtight nor sterile. Dr. Ranoli noticed mold on the surface of cardiac tissue, direct evidence of ongoing environmental interaction. The blood clots were stored in a chalice that offered little to no protection against fluctuations in humidity in the open air. Sixth, the biomolecular preservation of the relics would be extraordinary under any storage conditions, up to and including refrigeration in a laboratory. Traces of albumin can be recovered using highly sensitive modern techniques at nanogram level quantities. Globulins, especially alpha and beta globulins, almost never register at all. Against that background, Dr. Ranoli's results are inexplicable. The electrophoresis protocol he employed would not have produced sharp, well-defined peaks unless microgram level quantities of each type of protein were available. That implies the Lanciano relics retain serum proteins in abundances orders of magnitude greater than any comparable remains. Proportions. Electrophoretic tracings follow predictable trajectory as blood stains age. Albumin migrates, the alpha and beta bands vanish, the gamma band grows disproportionately large. This gamma inflation is so consistent that forensic scientists have suggested using it as a dating technique. Not only did the Lanciano relics preserve astonishingly high concentrations of serum proteins, they preserved them in the same relative proportions as fresh serum. Now let's consider modern fraud. The only plausible scenario that merits consideration involves falsification by Dr. Ranoli himself. Once again, that's precluded by multiple lines of evidence. First, even if Ranoli falsified his results in their entirety, that would only partially explain the origination and preservation of the relics. To fully explain the data, the skeptic has to posit that Ranoli's fraud was a cover-up for a similarly elaborate and nonsensical pre-modern fraud. Many of the features that exclude a pre-modern fraud can be inferred from the macroscopic appearance of the relics alone. Although the data that establishes species identity, absence of preservatives, and biomolecular preservation would be undercut, the historically implausible dissection, exceptional preservation, and highly unfavorable storage conditions would be left as remainder. Second, Dr. Ranoli didn't have a proportionate motive. Professionally, he had everything to lose and nothing to gain. If he associated himself with a miraculous claim, he risked being regarded with suspicion by all his colleagues. If his study was discredited, the reputational damage would have been catastrophic. As a properly catechized Catholic, he understood that bearing false witness, especially about a Eucharistic miracle, would endanger his soul rather than earn him any merit. Third, if Dr. Ranoli falsified his results, he did everything in his power to increase the likelihood that his fraud would be exposed. He voluntarily solicited the opinion of an independent expert, and he voluntarily submitted both photographs and raw data to a scholarly journal. Both of those measures were his idea. They weren't foisted upon him by anyone else. That is the opposite of the behavior that you would expect from a fraudster. Instead of minimizing outside scrutiny and retaining plausible deniability, he was much more transparent than he needed to be. That would have massively and needlessly increased both the risk and complexity of any fraudulent scheme. Fourth, Dr. Ranoli never had unfettered control over the relics themselves. He was entrusted only with small fragments for testing. The relics remained in ecclesiastical custody. That meant he had to be cognizant of the possibility that the custodians would ask an independent researcher to attempt to replicate his findings if any doubts arose. In fact, that safeguard was not merely a theoretical possibility. Recall that an investigator from the University of Siena independently reproduced the results of the AB blood grouping test that he performed. Fifth, if he falsified his results, why did he report negative results on Teichmann and Takayama, but then go on to report an electrophoretic tracing that was superimposable on fresh serum? Hemoglobin is known to be more chemically resilient than globulins, so this was an anomalous result. While the hypothesis of authenticity can easily accommodate this discordance, I find it hard to believe that a fraudster would have gone out of his way to invent anomalies that were sure to invite scrutiny rather than enhance his credibility. Sixth, it would not have been practically feasible for Ranoli to fabricate the micrographs that he published in a scholarly journal article. In the 1970s, photomicrography was film-based and digital editing was decades away. Falsifying the micrographs would have required Ranoli to get his hands on untreated ancient cardiac tissue. Yet such material was for all intents and purposes unobtainable. Pathology collections preserve organs in formalin, archaeological remains rarely retain recognizable myocardium, and when they do, it's mineralized or mummified. It's unclear where he could have gotten his hands on centuries-old, naturally desiccated cardiac tissue that's depicted in his micrographs. So now that we've excluded those naturalistic explanations, let's turn to preternatural explanations. The hypothesis that the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano is a demonic deception is wildly implausible. There are many points that could be made in this regard, but I will limit myself to two. One concerning the physical circumstances and another concerning the moral circumstances. As for the physical circumstances, the miraculous preservation of the relics exceeds the power of demons. This can be straightforwardly inferred from Scripture. For instance, in Romans 8, St. Paul refers to a pervasive, unavoidable, inexorable law of decay that God has imposed upon all of creation as a punishment. That means that you can't dispense from the law of decay without the active cooperation of God. And thus, to grant incorruption would be a uniquely divine prerogative following from that. That's also reaffirmed in Genesis 3 with how God actually phrases the curse of death that he imposes upon Adam. The language of "for you are dust, and to dust you shall return" to express the death curse indicates that decomposition is regarded as a natural completion of death, and that God's exclusive sovereignty over life and death, which is reaffirmed repeatedly throughout the Bible, extends to corruption and incorruption. Thus, granting incorruption should be viewed as a unique divine prerogative in the same way that resurrecting from the people from the dead is a uniquely divine prerogative. And then third, in Acts 13, St. Paul appeals to incorruption as a unique fruit of Christ's resurrection. And in fact, it's central to St. Paul's redemptive theology that is something that is unique. It's not a fruit that demons could just confer willy-nilly for 2,000 years to random relics. As for the moral circumstances, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist was uncontroversial among Christians at the time the relics came into existence. Furthermore, the relics didn't have any persuasive value for non-Catholics until more than 1,000 years later when they were scientifically examined. Since demons lack determinate foreknowledge, it makes no sense for them to try to execute plans on that timescale, especially plans with the foreseeable consequence of confirming people in their faith in Christ in the short term. Moreover, if sustained deceptions over centuries involving physical traces were within the scope of demonic power, it's extremely surprising that the only credible examples of them occur within Catholic contexts. The overall distribution of such miracles strongly disconfirms the expectations of my opponent's model. Now on to the vindicatory implications. Finally, now that we've established that the origination and preservation of the relics are best explained by a genuine miracle, let's think through the implications of the miracle. It is clear that the Eucharistic miracle of Lanciano was performed with a vindicatory intent that went far beyond the immediate context of the event. God produced tissue with evidentially significant features that would only become legible in modern times, and then miraculously conserved the relics so that they perdured until modern times. Moreover, he preserved them in such a way that suggests that he was more concerned with preserving their evidential value for modern scientists than with preserving their visual appearance for lay audiences. On the one hand, the heart tissue is mold-spotted, the blood clots are brittle and fissured, and their surfaces are dull and irregular. On the other hand, they've inexplicably retained enough structural integrity and immunoreactivity to confirm the organ and species identity for Dr. Ranoli. So what's the message of this that's being vindicated? At a minimum, it's obvious that the author of the miracle intended to confirm the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist and thus presupposed mere Christianity. We also may ask about transubstantiation in particular. So 2 points on that. First, it's worth pointing out that the perceptible change of the accidents of bread to the accidents of flesh during Eucharistic miracle does not constitute transubstantiation. Furthermore, the accidents of flesh that remain after the miracle do not inhere in our Lord. He's not the subject of those accidents. They exist in a similar way as the accidents of bread after the consecration when there's not a Eucharistic miracle. However, the perceptible change from accidents of bread to accidents of flesh signifies a change in substance. It's essential to distinguish between the sign and what it signifies. Padre Pio's stigmata signified Christ's 5 holy wounds, even though they were certainly not numerically identical to them. In fact, the locations didn't even perfectly correspond to those of Christ's wounds. Reasonable people understand that the accidents of bread perceptibly changing into accidents of flesh points to a change in the substance of a sort that is affirmed by the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. Second, the overall distribution of scientifically verified Eucharistic miracles uniquely privileges Catholicism. In addition to Lanciano, 5 other Eucharistic miracles have been corroborated by laboratory analyses, and all of them occurred within Catholic contexts. If Catholicism is true, that makes perfect sense. According to Catholic doctrine, the Eucharist can only be licitly confected by a priest that's in communion with Rome. Meanwhile, if Catholicism is false, the overall distribution of Eucharistic miracles is baffling. One might attempt to dismiss all of this as a sampling bias, but that overlooks a key point. If God intends to use these miracles to send a message, then verification is providential. There would be no reason for him to allow his intended message to be distorted by a sampling bias that it is completely within his power to correct.
All right, that was 20 minutes exactly. So let's now turn to Dale's opening statement. He's got some slides. Go ahead and start sharing those slides, Dale. And while you're doing that, I just want to let the audience know, if you're enjoying this so far, you want to see more stuff like this, then hit the like button on the video. It tells YouTube basically that this is a good video and that we should produce more of them. And then also leave a comment. Like if you're watching this and you've already had some thoughts going on in your mind, leave a comment below or wait until you watch the whole video and then do that later. But anyways, doing those two things really does help the channel out. So Dale, we'll turn it over to you. I will start sharing.
Mm-hmm. Just let me know.
Yeah, whenever you begin, I'll start your timer.
All right. So I just want to first start by saying thank you so much to Ethan and Cameron for doing this show. I think it is an important topic, even though it's not my particular area of specialization. I think it's crucial for Protestants to get involved and engage with this because this is evidence that is convincing a lot of people. And I've been getting tons of fan requests on my own channel asking me to address this issue. So I think it's crucial that we give it a good faith response as Protestants. So basically, from my understanding, the debate topic for today is, does the Eucharistic Miracle of Lanciano provide evidence for the truth of what we're calling for today's debate, basic transubstantiation? So this doesn't necessarily have to confirm Roman Catholic transubstantiation, so long as the miracle can confirm minimally that there is this real presence of Christ's body and blood via a substantive change. So the essential properties of the bread and wine are transformed to human blood and tissue. Obviously, Ethan is arguing the affirmative case, and I'm going to be doing my best to argue the negative. Now, because this isn't my area of expertise, I'm going to cheat a little bit. And my goal here is simply to provide some undercutting defeaters. I don't want to make a positive claim. I want to sort of raise defeaters and show that there are alternative hypotheses that can explain all of the data equally well to positing basic transubstantiation, or perhaps it's even more likely. But my minimal goal is to show that at least one of them is equally probable. And if that's the case, then I win this debate. So what are the 3 alternative explanatory hypotheses? Well, the first is you can posit some kind of naturalistic explanation. Ethan mentioned fraud, and that's the route I'll be going down. But there's also, you could say it's supernatural, but it's due to some kind of satanic or demonic act. And finally, we can admit maybe it is a supernatural act of God. It's a supernatural miracle. But that doesn't mean it has to serve the purpose of authenticating transubstantiation. God performs miracles for various purposes. So I'm convinced by the evidence from Lourdes, even as a Protestant. But I think miracles of healing are miracles of compassion. They're not meant to authenticate Catholicism or Orthodoxy or something like that. All right, so what is the miracle of Lanciano? Basically, Ethan did my job and kind of explained the history. So there was a Basilian hero monk, which means he was both a priest and a monk, and he was trying to escape iconoclasm sometime between 730 and 750 AD, and so he went to the city of Lanciano and was serving as a priest monk there. Now, he had doubts about the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and allegedly, according to the story, God miraculously transformed the bread and wine into flesh and blood before his own eyes, thereby confirming this real presence or this basic transubstantiation. Now, historically, the first confirmed report, the one that everybody agrees to, dates to 1574, when the Archbishop Gaspar Rodriguez investigated the relics, and he weighed each of the blood clots and found that they all had the same weight and that sort of thing. And since then, there's been an inspection done every 100 years or so, basically 100 years, a little bit less. And during one of those in 1886, it's important to note they weighed these samples, and they came out with different weights and different measurements. So that's just a note there. Now, in terms of the modern scientific investigation, again, Ethan did a great job summarizing it, better than I could do, so I'll go through this quickly. But on November 18th, 1970, at 10:15 a.m., the Archbishop broke the 1886 seals. So 1886 was the last time there was an official investigation where they checked the relics and then they put on a little seal to prevent tampering in the future. And this was done in the presence of many eyewitnesses, where they opened up the monstrance and took out the samples, and they gave it to Dr. Eduardo Linoli, who was a professor of anatomy and pathological histology in Italy. And when he took out the samples, he said, to the touch, the blood was hard, almost wooden-like, and that's typical of organic substances as opposed to other types of substances. And he said he noted that the case where the tissue was not airtight, and that the tissue was clearly contaminated by some kind of bacteria or fungus. Now, he took these samples with him back to his labs and studied them, and he did involve his personal friend, Professor Ruggero Bertelli. So, again, I wouldn't say this qualifies as independent peer review. You are taking it to your colleague who works with you at the university and that sort of thing, and was your personal friend. But it is important to note that there was a second pair of eyes, and one that was an atheist and not a biased Catholic or something like that, that did confirm at least the histological aspects about the heart tissue. Now, Linoli published his results in 1971. Now, here's a problem that he only published in his own periodical or journal. It wasn't a properly peer-reviewed journal, and he was the owner and editor of the journal. So this does raise some suspicions a little bit. It's kind of like in shroud studies, Walter Macron, he claimed the shroud was just a painting. And again, he published his results in his own journal, The Microscope. So I think it raises reasonable doubts. Why aren't you publishing in a credible peer-reviewed journal that's independent of yourself? Additionally, in 1981, he also did additional studies on the heart tissue, specifically on fragments that weren't used in his 71 investigation. So what were his findings? So again, Ethan summarized these great. So there's a gross anatomy. I summarize it as basically the flesh was real organic tissue. And this was later confirmed by more empirical tests in histology, microchemistry, and hematology, where they proved, yep, the blood is blood, and the flesh is probably some kind of heart tissue. And I think this is probably substantiated given the tests that we had. So I don't dispute this. I don't think this was fraud on Linoli's part. I think what he studied, he was genuine in taking those samples, and it revealed this much. There's one thing that'll be key here is Dr. Linoli also emphasized that the proteins in the blood had a normal distribution, meaning, as Ethan puts it, the sequence and proportions of the protein fractions were completely regular and comparable to that of fresh serum. That's going to be an issue later on. Now, in terms of the other claims that the blood and flesh was proven to be human, I do not grant that. I think that is unsubstantiated on the basis of the immunological test that he used. And I appeal to Dr. Kelly Kearse, where basically Linoli did not use proper controls to establish this. And he didn't fully consider this issue called cross-reactivity. And basically that means that his test was not specific enough to be exclusive to human beings. And that's what modern science has to say about this test. In terms of the blood group being type AB, again, I think this is also unsubstantiated. As a serological test, he used the absorption elution test, and that is highly controversial in the field. Again, appealing to Kelly Kearse, he's proven in a peer-reviewed journal that we can't prove on the basis of this test that the reaction that's taking place that's indicative of AB antigens coming from human, we can't distinguish those AB antigens from sources like bacteria. Again, remember the sample was contaminated by bacteria. And so this is a live possibility that explains why it came back with blood type AB. And I want to note, even Catholic apologists like Franco Serafini and Matthew Levon, who I had on my show, and I would say, even if I'm going to be a bit cheeky here, even Ethan himself, indirectly on his blog, through kind of hedging himself, sort of admits that this test is problematic. There's something that's insufficient about it on its own merits. And here's just a picture of Kelly Kearse talking about what proper controls would have been. He is saying that he would have preferred some faux blood or faux tissue, such as a non-consecrated section of wafer, to be tested, again, just to confirm as a proper control that the reactivity between the antigens and the antibodies is authentic. And this was not done in Lannoli's case. And this, according to Kelly Kearse, this is standard immunological practice, at least today. Okay, so let's get to my hypotheses and start with my naturalistic explanation. So if this is not a supernatural event, how do we explain it? And I think that I appeal to misidentification, some exaggeration on Lannoli's part, innocent, not deliberate fraud, and deliberate fraud on the part of the Church of Lanciano. So first of all, what is the plausibility of fraud? Well, look, historical documents mention that the first known mention of the miracle is in 1574. That's the first uncontroversial mention of it. And the churchmen conducted inspections every 100 years after that. So prior to 1970, the last time the samples were officially inspected was in 1886. And apparently the 1886 seal was still intact when they did this 1970 investigation. So these would seemingly speak against fraud. However, in the first place, from between 1574 to 1886, we have no idea how many times the samples would have been switched out. Remember, I said they studied the weight of the samples in 1574, and they claimed it was a miracle, but they found that the samples were all weighed the same amount. And even more miraculously, combined, it weighed as much as all samples combined, kind of thing. But if I'm looking beyond that, I would say, okay, maybe they had samples that were all approximately the same weight in 1574. And the reason when they weighed them later on during inspections, they got different weights is because there was a switcheroo that happened. They switched out the samples. So this makes it a plausible explanation that at least since 1574, they switched out the samples. Additionally, in 1886, I said they put on a seal. But would that prevent a switcheroo of samples? I don't think so. The duplication of seals, I looked into this, is quite easy. Just making sort of a wax imprint of them and stuff like that. So long as the seals are kept in good condition and you're trying to get basic fidelity, or in this case, we're talking about the church that had the original seals themselves, right? They would, according to my understanding, Catholic churches, from what I looked up, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but they keep their old seals for historical continuity purposes. So they had access to the original thing that made the seal in the first place. So yeah, it would have been very trivially easy for them to break a seal and then reproduce it and put it back on. So basically, anytime between 1886 and 1970, nothing prevented a switcheroo of samples taking place. And if I'm trying to guess, I don't want to be locked into anything, but just as my best guess, I think the most likely time would have probably been the 1960s, when the church was first starting to think about having the samples scientifically tested. This would provide an obvious motivation as to why to do it. That said, I'm not locked into this. There were other opportunities. For example, from 1920 to 1952, the church was taken over and apparently hosted a Masonic lodge, and it was no longer governed by the St. Francis. It became the Franciscans. It became a parish church. Okay, maybe there was an opportunity, something happened during that time. Or even going back further in time, in 1809, Napoleon arrived in Lanciano and he took over the church and used it as a barracks. The friars went missing. Did a switcheroo happen at that time? So there have been various plausible opportunities for a switch to take place. And I don't think the fact that it has a seal does anything to prevent that. Okay, and people were unlikely to check for seal fidelity. One of Ethan's counters to this, and maybe I should have waited for him to say it. Well, you can tell if it's not aged properly. It's not dark. It's not cracked. But the public wouldn't be inspecting this in the first place. It was far out of their eyesight and had to be moved only first in 1902 to its current location. So, and even in its current location, I highly doubt that regular laymen going to church are inspecting seals to, does this date back to the 1800s? Does it have all the telltale signs of age? No, that's very improbable. Okay, so yeah, that's that's my explanation. We have no idea where the samples came from. I'm not going to specify that. I'm not going to specify how old the samples are. Maybe they're getting them from wherever, right? That we don't have to posit that they're killing someone and taking their heart tissue and blood in real time to switch out the samples. That's not what I'm arguing necessarily. Who knows where they got the samples from and how old those samples that were there in 1970 actually are, actually were. So, okay. That's my naturalistic explanation. Now, in terms of the plausibility of fraud, I'm attributing fraud to the churchmen, not necessarily Dr. Linoli. And I think there are some aspects that suggest this, or at least make it equally plausible. The first is that Dr. Franco Serafini himself admitted that the Lanciano churchmen, when he went to investigate, he said, so first of all, they were aware of problems with the historical provenance of this Lanciano miracle. And because of that reason, they needed to, quote unquote, select a non-hostile Catholic scientist. And that ended to be Dr. Linoli. Again, if this is just about pure science, why are you carefully selecting someone who you know will be non-hostile to your cause, kind of thing? That seems a bit weird. Furthermore, there was no blind testing done on these samples, and there was lack of proper controls, as I kind of mentioned in some of the test case. But most damning is that the churchmen or the friars in the 1970s were actually reasonably connected to a known fraud, right? The WHO fraud that everybody admits to, and Ethan will admit to. I would agree Dr. Linoli had nothing to do with this, and he condemned this fraud. But basically in 2016, Franco Serafini proved that there were various Catholic sources claiming that there was a report from the United Nations and the WHO where they did 500 scientific experiments related to Lanciano miracle and confirming Linoli's findings. And this was proven to be total rubbish. Everybody agrees with this. But it raises questions, why was the Church of Lanciano holding on to this known fraud? And it becomes even more questionable to me because we have a 1977 letter from Linoli advising them, get rid of that thing, destroy it. It's fraudulent. But yet they held on to this report until Franco Serafini came in 2016. So I think this at least provides circumstantial evidence to the fact that maybe in the 1960s and 70s, the people running the church in charge of this sample could have been motivated to commit a fraud and switched out the samples. Okay, defeater number 2, very quickly. So maybe it is supernatural, but Satan did it. We know that Satan can perform signs and wonders to fool Christians. And here's a piece of evidence that I think supports this. Remember, Dr. Linoli proved that the samples had a normal distribution of proteins. Well, medically speaking, that shouldn't be the case. If, according to the doctrine of transubstantiation, you are representing the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, his blood should be in the same state, if I'm understanding Catholic doctrine properly, as it was on the cross. And medically, we know, that it would not be in this state of being like fresh serum or having a regular, completely regular distribution of proteins. No, those things would be all out of whack. And in fact, for those of you in the audience who like the Shroud of Turin, my friend Giulio Fonte has done a scientific investigation on the blood of the shroud. And guess what we find? The proteins are all out of whack. There's various aspects indicating that the blood stains were privy to a body in a violent trauma state. So they were in non-normal distributions. And that contradicts. So the shroud seems to be contradicting. If that's the blood of Jesus, as I believe, then that contradicts this Lanciano miracle. They can't both be true. Finally, it's important to note they did no DNA or genetic testing at all. And remember, even basic transubstantiation requires a substantive change. Now, I argue, maybe this is my unique metaphysics, that the part of the essence of a human being involves our DNA. So to be a human being, you have to be a person embodied in a physical body governed by the human genome. The human genome is part of the essence. There's no proof that there's any human DNA or genetic or STR profiles or anything of that nature that would prove that a substantive change actually take place. And without that kind of proof, there's nothing specific to rule out, well, maybe this is an Eastern Orthodox miracle. Maybe it's supporting Roman Catholic. Maybe it's supporting the Assyrian Church of the East. Mere location of the miracle alone is not a sufficient attachment to prove that it's authenticating the religious context that it takes place in. And like I said, Eucharistic miracles take place in the Orthodox Church, in the Assyrian Church of the East. They have various stories as well. So now, with this, given that there's no DNA verification, my final argument is that this forces it to reduce down to a satanic trick. Because if it was a miracle of God, he would have given us the evidence that we need in terms of the DNA to prove the doctrine that a substantive change took place. As it is now, at best, all it does is serve to falsify Protestantism. It's just saying, hey, you Protestants, you don't believe in basic transubstantiation, you're wrong. Now, that doesn't fit God's MO for miracles in the Bible. I never see God doing miracles just to discredit people. It's always to positively authenticate his specific religious message, right? So imagine Jesus performing a miracle in the Bible, and that miracle, all it does is serve to disprove the Sadducees as wrong. But then Jesus says, okay, my job's done. Now it's up to you to figure out whether you follow the Pharisees, the Essenes, or you're going to follow my messianic move. No, Jesus performs miracles.
We are out of time.
Yeah,
we are out of time. We've gone a little bit over. I want to mention really quickly that we are actually in this stream we're doing an after show, and this is something new for members. So if you want to become a member and join the after show with me and Ethan after this debate, you just join and become a catechumen, the $4.99 a month. If you want to join at a higher amount, all that does is basically just support us even more. But everything that we offer, early access, members only live streams, all of that is available at the $4.99 a month to be a channel member. So that's what we've got going on after this debate. I would love to see you guys join us there. Now let's turn into open dialogue. So Ethan, go ahead and take it away. And where would you like to pick up on Dale's presentation?
Yeah, well, so I think what we agreed to talk about first was the identification of the relics. And so Dale had raised some questions about that. So the first place I think I want to start is with the species identification of the relics. So whether we can prove that these are basically human heart tissue and human blood. So I guess the first thing I would just start by asking you, Dale, is does Kelly Kurse, has he published anything about the precipitin test? Does he have any specialized knowledge or expertise about the precipitin test besides one throwaway line in a publication about another topic?
No. So as far as I know, he is an immunologist. So it is.
But I'm just saying he's not an expert in this test. So then I just want to, what I want to do is actually cite the world's foremost expert on the test. So this is Dr. Ganslin, and he's the head of the forensic science program at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And he's characterizing after he's doing a lengthy literature review of the precipitin test for the DOJ source book in 1984. So here's what he said. The development of a specific immunological test for the determination of the species of origin of blood stains was a major event in the evolution of legal medicine. It provided for the first time a technique for unequivocally establishing species origin in stains. All authorities soon came to agree on the specificity and the certainty provided by the new method. Wood, having said to the Massachusetts Medico Legal Society that one could finally testify absolutely as to the species of origin of bloodstains, rather than having to say that the results were consistent with the stain having originated from a particular species. So I guess my question is, why should we trust Kearse rather than the world's leading expert on the test?
Yeah, so first of all, I didn't know he was the world's leading expert in that sort of thing when I read it on your blog. So that's great to have that quote. But I think what I would say in response is look at the indicators. So in the quote, he's talking about based on forensic consensus. So based on my discussions with Kelly Kearse, I think what they're appealing to is basically it works great in fields like forensics where we have forensic clues that help us eliminate the cross reactivity issues, right? So you have obviously
the whole
with certain
purpose of the
crimes.
test. So let's just be clear on what the test is. So the whole point of the test is we're going to create an anti-sera that's only going to react with the characteristic proteins of humans. And so specifically who Dr. Ranoli is buying it from is the most reputable supplier of the anti-sera in the world. And what they do, because they need it, it's accepted by all courts as proof beyond reasonable doubt in criminal cases, right? And if they had cross-reactivity for these anti-sera, they would lose their admissibility and then their whole business would collapse. So they do these huge panels of validation tests against controls. So what Lanoli's doing is actually just out of an abundance of caution, he's doing his own controls. But the presumption is that the supplier of the anti-sera who's selling forensic grade anti-sera has already done basically that. And just one thing before I let you get in, which is just I corresponded with Dr. Kearse about this, and I want everyone to hear what Dr. Kearse has to say in reply to me bringing up this point about how the standard practice at that time was removal of heterospecific antibodies by by adsorption, absorption, explicit tests against panels of other species, and minimum potency requirements. So he replies, the passage in the article is in reference to the statement by Serafini that it is, quote, qualitatively unquestionable that the miracle of Lanciano contains true human blood. I think that unquestionable is a very strong word. Yes, those procedures were used for early polyclonal anti-sera at the time, but it's difficult to know if such tests were all-inclusive. Also, the wording was not absolute in meaning. The phrase potentially cross-reactive was intentionally chosen. It's a good point you make, yes, but I don't believe that one can be entirely sure.
Yeah, so he the way I read that when I read that on your blog is he's saying exactly what he said on my show about these forensic grade tests and stuff like that, or basically it's talking about when we have certain clues that help us eliminate unknown species that would have also gotten a positive hit, right? So when somebody commits a crime, if somebody's shot in the head, obviously if you get a hit for human blood, human beings are the only ones that can do that. So that's why it works in a court of law to prove beyond all reasonable doubt that it is human blood or human blood on site and stuff like that. Or likewise, if you have like an animal attack and you're wondering, oh, is it a bear or a wolf or something like that, and they're totally they don't work together, and you get a hit on the wolf. Well, maybe it still would have gotten a hit for some other animal or something like that, but based on the forensic context, we can eliminate it down to either a wolf or a bear, and that's why it's good enough, from my understanding, in a court of law to say it's
So here's the actual forensic practice for it. So here's the things. So basically, the only thing that you're going to get a cross reaction with, unless it was just like a defective sample that you were sent by the supplier, like it was just very low quality anti-sera, the only thing you're going to get it with is a non-human primate. So this is what Dr. Ganslin says in his 2000 textbook. So properly controlled and conducted tests for human blood can be considered specific if it is not possible that a non-human primate was the source of the blood. Similarly, tests for common farm animals, cats, dogs, some wild game animals are specific in terms of distinguishing them from humans and from one another. Normally, the interpretation of species test results is straightforward, and test results are easy to read by the experienced professional. Positive results show that a blood stain is from the species for which the anti-serum is specific. So basically, the only thing you're going to get a cross-reaction with for the precipitin test is non-human primate. And for a fraudster, that's even less plausible than a human corpse.
So, okay, well, I guess let me ask this then. How is he making that confident statement that only a non-human primate could be the alternatives? Because again, from what Dr. Kelly Kearse has explained to me when he's been on the show with this cross-reactivity issue, is that obviously they have various amounts of unknown species that have never been tested, and therefore we just can't know. And from my understanding, that's what his answer to you was in his email, kind of thing. So how is he eliminating it only?
I mean, his answer in the email, in my interpretation, is basically just to concede. But basically, what he's saying is, okay, yeah, but unquestionable. Is it unquestionable that you're not a brain in a vat? And so that was just talking about the anti-Sera themselves, because I think he knows personally. I think he knows that the forensic literature, for the extensive validations that have led it for decades to be accepted by every court in the world as proof in criminal cases, I think he knows that he's tilting at windmills here. But then we go to the actual control tests that Lannoli did. So in terms of the actual controls that he did, which is just to show that you don't get promiscuous cross-reactivity. That's all you're really trying to do with just the controls that he's doing in the laboratory that day. So what he's trying to do is say, okay, I'm going to do rabbit, I'm going to do bovine, I'm just going to show you that it's not just going to react with anything, right? And so basically he does a positive demonstration of that. Now, Kearse, in his correspondence with me, his only criticism actually is that he didn't, in the experimental matrix, he didn't include basically having actual rabbit and having actual bovine to demonstrate potency for the rabbit and the bovine anti-sera. But notice what that situation requires. So it requires the reputable supplier to have sent him 2 completely impotent bovine and rabbit anti-sera, and then sent him a completely cross-reactive human anti-sera in the same shipment. That's absurd. Mm-hmm. That's crazy. What's the likelihood of that?
Well, so perhaps from a practicality standpoint, that might be absurd to expect them to do that. But from a just seeking the truth standpoint, obviously, in order to eliminate and make sure that the antibodies and antigens are going to react properly, you need that control sample of the bovine and that sort of thing, just to make sure that it's actually working on that day properly. Because otherwise, you could get like a false positive result. And I think that's what Kelly's main point there is with the bovine.
He's talking about double impotency in the controls, which is very unlikely. And especially since you're asking for opposite problems, right? So you're asking for both of the controls to have been completely impotent, where they won't react with anything, but then you're asking for the human anti-sera to be so promiscuously cross-reactive that it will react with anything, right? So you're basically asking for opposite problems. So all the controls, and it seems like a super ad hoc theory. But okay, but I think I've said what I want to say on that point. I think the last thing I want to say on species, the last thing I just wanted to say on species, and then you say whatever you want about species. But the last thing I want to say about species is just, from what I can tell in your opening statement, you're conceding the immunoelectrophoresis results. So for the serum profile of the blood, but that's human specific.
So from what I've been told, it's not human specific. It can only prove that there's blood, but it doesn't prove that it's a human species.
No, so I have, in my original article for Lanciano, I have like an Irfan 1967, where we go and show the proportions for basically all of the different common domestic animals. And like, okay, fine, I can't do like iguanas and stuff like that, but it's totally implausible for the same, but going through all the comments, like if I were a fraudster, like I'm just telling you personally, obviously we need to rule out more than this, but I would obviously use a pig if I wanted to get a heart, like just obvious. But regardless, we can show you that the basically for all the common domestic animals, the electrophoretic tracing he got is superimposable on fresh human blood, but it has stuff that basically it doesn't correspond. It's discordant. So basically what you'd be asking for is there to have been a selective migration towards a human profile from whatever these domestic animal profiles were.
Whatever they were using, yeah. like I said, I'm just going because I'm not a scientist, so I am obviously deferring to not just Kelly Kears, but even Stacy when you debated her, and she was sort of saying the same thing that it just this test isn't specific enough to absolutely prove that it is human blood. Sorry, even to prove on a balance of probabilities that it's human in origin. So yeah, I don't know if there's something that can affect the results to shift it towards the human, but
Oh, no,
when Kelly was on my show,
I think Kirsten Tersenko's will concede a balance of probabilities. They'll say it's probably
to
human, right? Like even that guy
no,
Maxime concedes it's probably human.
no. So I don't want to waste time, but I could play a clip when he was on my show. He specifically said this test that we're talking about here probably shows it's blood. So when I said that, okay, both criterion of enemy attestation, both sides are agreeing. But he said there's no way it's specific enough to say this is
Oh,
human. So
you're
he
talking about
outright,
you're talking about electrophoresis right now, right?
yeah, I thought that's what we were talking about.
Yeah. So you're talking about electrophoresis, and I mean I agree. So nobody's going to use electrophoresis as the primary way to determine species. Um,
Okay.
but but when you actually have something like this, is actually a very unusual profile because we're saying it's basically exactly like the fresh blood, even though it's an age sample. And because you get things like the gamma inflation and stuff like that that happens with aging, and also you just wind up getting proportions that are so low that your signals are very noisy. If you didn't have like the super clean fractionation, I think it would hold in general that you probably wouldn't want to use it. But at least as like a corroborative test for species. So we already started out with this like overwhelmingly strong presumption on the balance of probabilities based off of the precipitin test, which is fully valid. And so then basically to have a corroborative test where the electrophoretic tracing is is consistent with humans, I think is. But I mean, actually, I said it's the last thing. So is there something else you wanted on species?
Yeah, just one last thing. So again, it seems like the most conclusive thing that's actually going to push us over the line is the original. I don't know how to say it, Ulethith test or something that where we're talking about these antigens and antibodies reacting in the tubes, kind of thing. Now, Kelly Kears does look. Forget about the bovine and the rat thing. Even if you don't accept those as improper controls or a problem, he does mention that the main thing with the humans, because on that front, when he tested the humans, he did have a proper control there. But he's saying that there should have been additional things with faux blood and faux tissue, right? Like maybe he speculates a non consecrated wafer just to do our extra due diligence and rule out any possibility of getting that false positive. And again, from what Kelly Kears has said, I know I'm not a scientist, so I have to appeal to authority here. But he's saying that would have been standard immunological practice to have those
Well,
controls. So, what's your
just to be
take on this?
clear, so Dr. Winoli is much more of an authority on the on the forensic practice and the medical practice at that time than Dr. Kears, right? Like Dr. Kears, he's an immunologist. He's a very smart man. I've talked with him. He's very knowledgeable. He knows a lot more about immunology than I do, right? But he's also, he doesn't have practical experience the way that Dr. Winoli does. Dr. Winoli is very much informed about all of the tests that he employed. Are there ways where going back on literally any scientist's experimental protocol, like if you've ever gotten feedback from even people who are scientifically minded, you'll realize that there's always a nitpick. You would never be able to prove anything if you let the nitpicks. And I've noticed this about Dr. Kears is that he tends to have this epistemology where he says, well, because it's an extraordinary claim, therefore I'm going to basically set aside proof that would otherwise be conclusive in other contexts. And because the prior for the miracle is so low, basically he's insisting on this. But that's a sort of philosophical perspective that he has and not necessarily a reflection of his like technical expertise.
Yeah, and I have heard him say that too. So I try to, like the argument going above and beyond. That's cool, but yeah, I don't take that as seriously. But when he says something standard immunological practice, like having those faux control samples just to ensure it's not due to anything else and not a false positive, and then Linoli doesn't have it. Now, you mentioned Linoli
That I
oh,
would like proof
can I
on.
just
So I'd
I
like
don't want to
proof.
interrupt. Can I
Oh,
let
sorry,
me
sorry,
just
sorry.
No, no. I'll just finish this sentence and then you go. And I want to hear what you have to say seriously about this. So, um, what was I saying? Yeah. So you mentioned Lannoli is a better qualified expert than Kelly Kears, and maybe on paper, but remember, Lannoli's operating in the early 1970s. So I actually think we could say we should prefer Kelly Kears because he has access to modern knowledge where we've learned certain problems about the field, kind of thing, such as not having those controls just to rule out that, right? Like we didn't know about the issues of cross reactivity that he's brought up, for example, until later on and stuff like that. So in light of modern knowledge, we could maybe argue Kelly Kears is more authoritative. But what's your response on that?
I'm not aware, and I mean I've looked into it. Though obviously I'm not an expert, but I've looked into it, and I'm not aware of anything we've learned about cross reactivity for the precipitin test since basically the 1980s. That I mean, but basically going back to that's relevant. You know, like I mean, and people knew about cross reactivity just conceptually because the entire point of having a species test, like the entire point of it, is that it's supposed to be specific to the species. So the entire project is avoiding cross reactions with non-human species. So what they did, and this is something that Dr. Ganslin is really good about, is going through these huge numbers of studies that were done all over the world where we test for cross reactions to see how specific the test is to make sure that it can meet like a standard of evidence to be admissible in court. But yeah, so I don't think it's true. You know, I mean, in terms of being more careful or more meticulous, sure, I think you can always do that. But from the commentary that I've heard, for instance, from talking to people like Dr. Serafini, for this type of task, it seemed like he was actually unusually rigorous given the standards of the time. Now, the thing that happens now is that obviously we would just do like, I mean, in this case, it may be too degraded for us to do it. But in a lot of forensic contexts, we've kind of completely given up on doing stuff with some of this like precipitin stuff and some of this serology stuff just because we have high throughput genotyping now. And it's just so much better than everything, you know, but.
Yeah. Oh, am I frozen? Hello?
No, you're good.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was having the lag effect there for a second. So. Okay, yeah, like I said, I wanted to give you the last word on that. So yeah, I just wanted to stress again that I think modern practice would say I would want to see those faux control samples being used just to cross the T's, dot the I's, and push me over the edge to say, okay, probably this is human blood and tissue. And certainly, even if it is human blood and tissue, that I don't think that's going to be a major issue explanatorily. Like that, okay, they instead of swapping out pig stuff, they swapped out human tissue. So yeah, maybe we could move on. Oh yeah, what's the next topic you'd want to do?
Oh yeah, so then the next one I think we had agreed to do was the A/B tests, which I think is an important one because that's probably one that most of our viewers also have heard about because it's the one that gets discussed the most is this A/B test. And so I think it's, and I don't know, do you want to lead on this one since I led on the last one, or do you want me to jump off?
Yeah, oh sure. So basically, as I said in my presentation, and as Ethan said, they did do Lannoli did do a test and got positive results for the blood type being AB, and this is something that's really important for Roman Catholics because it's consistent with other Eucharistic miracles. Ethan mentioned there's five others, and that sort of thing, outside the scope of this debate, but same with the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo and that sort of thing. So this is one of the more important things, and it speaks to the plausibility of a switcheroo, the switching of the samples, because finding someone that had blood type AB would be remarkably hard. It's a very rare blood type group. So I think that's the relevance to the fraud. And okay, echoing there. So and that's why you would want to establish that, because it does put some strain on my theory of them switching it out. They needed, almost without even knowing it, to get the proper person with the proper blood type. Now, yeah, in terms of have they proven that, like I said, I just don't think they've done enough to push us over the line. And I gave my reasons for that. Basically, where is it? Okay, so again, appealing to Dr. Kelly Kears, and he does have a peer-reviewed paper on this where he talks about the issue of bacteria contamination. And I know you've got some counters to that you raised. So yeah, I'll turn it over to you to give your counters, and then I'll try to respond to that.
Yeah. So basically, what I notice from the skeptics like Dr. Trasankos and Dr. Kurse who talk about this is they bring up to people that there's a theoretical possibility, right, of basically bacterial mimicry of the A and B antigens that can give basically positive, like agglutination reactions when you run these tests. And that's true. Another thing that can happen is that basically you actually do have an underlying substrate that's genuine blood, which in this case I think you're conceding actually. And then the question would just be whether the bacteria is leading to basically a mistyping of the blood. So basically, like one of the common examples is like you have like acquired A or acquired B. So the original blood type was B, and then you didn't have A antigens, but then basically because of bacterial contamination, you got an AB result. Now, I think the thing is, given what the AB test was meant to prove in the first instance, which is just like, okay, like population level prevalence in Italy, like, I mean, I don't know, I think it's like 3% or 4% in modern Italy for AB. So basically, in order for this to actually be a good objection, the probability of the bacterial hypothesis needs to not be much lower than the 4% just for getting the AB by random chance. But there's never any attempt that's made to demonstrate that. And in fact, when we look at the statistics, we realize that that's a very remote possibility. Because notice, so the first thing is we have actually triplicate replications of the AB result. So we have it in the flesh and in the blood. And then we have a second test that was done independently by Siena on the blood. And so all of those are giving us AB. Now, what you would naturally expect if it's bacterial contamination is basically that if you had like an acquired A phenomenon in one of the samples, then what would happen is you'd have discordances between the samples where you didn't get the acquired A phenomenon and then the ones where you did, because the bacterial contamination is going to be localized, right? And so, meanwhile, unless you're just saying that the whole relics, all of them, both substrates are completely proliferated with bacteria, which one makes the preservation even more naturalistically inexplicable, because that's completely insane. Also, like, it doesn't really make sense for desiccated relics. Also, it doesn't make sense that Linoli, in all of the histological slides that he took from right around where they're performing the test, he doesn't find any bacteria visible in those regions, the peripheral area on the sample. But so if we look at it statistically, basically I calculated it, and I think the probability just based off of this study they did with about, like, if I recall correctly, 1,500 bones, where they went and they buried them underground and they simulated basically like very harsh aging for these bones, and then they went and retested them. My estimate for the probability of triplicate concordant AB, very conservative upper bound for the probability, is 0.05%.
Interesting. Okay. So I had a question of my own, but I guess, so first of all, I'll just say, and this is why I wanted to be vague, purposefully vague on specifying, like, where does the sample that they switched in, where does it come from, and when? So I remember in your blog, you were kind of going over how there's, the statistics based on Italy. Well, I mean, we're talking about it's a modern switcheroo, so who knows where the sample actually came from. It could have come from places like Israel and Egypt, which I know you say that there, or at least, some part of the tissue came from there, kind of thing, that they tested, kind of thing. So, like, yeah, why would you need to assume that the sample came from Italy, whereby it would be very improbable? I think you said 4% or something that we would get this result. What if it did come from another area where an AB contamination would be more likely?
Well, basically, if you treated it as like a random sample from the entire global population, I think it's still going to be like 4%, 5%.
Gotcha. Okay, but you appealed to an issue from samples from Israel and Egypt, if I'm remembering properly, right?
In that case, it's actually, so here's what happens. So the thing Kelly Kurse is really worried about is the fact that there's this concordance between all of these relics, right? So the Sudarium, the Shroud, and then all of these different Eucharistic relics, so like Tixtla and Lanciano, where we're getting A-B results from all of these different Catholic relics. And this is what leads Dr. Serafini to calculate, I think, if I recall correctly, it's like 1 in 6 million is his estimate for the probability of the coincidence. So what Kelly Kerse wanted to establish is that there's actually an A-B skew in basically the bacterial contamination. So when you had basically erroneous typings, it would be expected that you'd have a higher prevalence of AB compared to other blood types. And I think that's actually completely backwards. And there's actually archaeological literature that works with that premise, that actually you should have a bias against AB rather than in favor of it. But he rests his entire case on a study of basically Israeli mummies, where they found, basically just comparing to the current population genetics, for the descendants, like the lineal descendants of these ancient Israelites, they would have had this enormous, massive, disproportionate prevalence of AB if we're just going based off of the Jerusalem mummy study that they did. Now, so he's saying, well, so therefore, because I think it's not plausible that basically from a population genetic standpoint that the gene frequencies change so much, instead what we should infer is that the results were erroneous and that therefore there was some kind of AB bias that was biasing the results towards having that higher prevalence of AB. Now, what I push back on in my article is I show, actually, if we just go to the original article and see the arguments that it makes for its own reliability, those are way more convincing than Kelly Kerse's critique. So Kelly Kerse's only source that he cites where he makes this argument, at least the one that the venue where I saw him make this argument and he cited it, the only source he cites is babymed.com, which is describing the current distribution of AB. Okay, and so meanwhile, the study that he's citing to prove his point cites population genetics literature to prove the plausibility of their gene frequencies, which is basically saying you could have isolated pockets in these ancient Mesopotamian populations where they had very different gene distributions than we have now. And they basically say that almost any distribution would be possible, would be feasible within those. And then basically in addition to that, what we showed was when you did it in Egypt and when you did it in Israel, you got an AB skew. But then when you did it in Italy, and then you go and compare it against the modern gene frequencies, you exactly reproduced it. So that you exactly reproduced it in Italy. And then in addition to that, they tested for contamination where they did like triplicate replications and they tested all the ground, the soil surrounding where they were doing it when they were doing it with all of these mummies, or skeletons or whatever. So anyways, what I take his argument there basically just rests upon like, doesn't it sound weird or doesn't it sound implausible that the AB frequency would have changed so much over this short of a time? But he doesn't actually engage rigorously with the arguments that the people who authored the paper made to address those exact concerns, which I also think kind of raises questions for us about how much we should be deferring or trusting Kelly Kerse's scholarship.
Okay, so you raised some interesting points there, including the last one, which I think is perfectly valid, that we need to take into account. So first thing I'll just say, so you started with Franco Serafini and 1 in 6 million odds. So I just want to clarify for the purposes of this debate that I think this is a valid comeback that deserves a counter rebuttal in terms of, well, when you take all 5 Eucharistic miracles, the different tests they did to get the AB result. So Matthew Levon argued this in his debate with Kevin Nontradikath, and also the AB blood type on the shroud and the Sterium. Okay, how do you address that cumulative argument? That said, I'm not going to answer that in today's debate because the topic is Lanciano. So as far as I know, those objects don't necessarily exist, or maybe they're fake Eucharistic miracles that they're not within the scope. So I'm going to just resist giving like a response to the cumulative argument on that. Now, in terms of AB on the Eucharistic Miracle of Lanciano, okay, I think your answer, it could be true. It does seem far-fetched to my layman mind that like, okay, the distribution of AB blood type was radically different, or there was a lot more people in the ancient times in certain areas relative to today. But that could be, yeah, there's no proof against that. So I guess what I would just say, for the purposes of this debate, my goal is just to provide an equally probable defeater. And if there are areas and stuff like that at certain times where this AB prevalence does come up, wouldn't it be at least equally probable to say that, well, there's some kind of bacterial or other reason other than the fact that they're blood type AB that's equally probable? Like, do you have a way to say no? They're probably, it's probably because they are blood type AB in these Israeli
Well,
and Egyptian
yeah,
examples.
what I'm doing is, so he's presenting as basically a defeater to our evidence for reliability. He's presenting as a defeater these Jerusalem mummies as an explanation for the AB skew. So then if I go and show that actually bacteria is a very poor explanation for the Israeli mummy studies, and then it turns out that actually, no, the only argument he has for implausibility is just based off of like his a priori conjecture standing against the actual population genetics models where I found it. It's Brewis 63. So it says the great variety of theoretically possible combinations of the ABO blood group frequencies in isolated populations of ancient times was demonstrated by Brewis 63 in her models for selecting phenotypes in the ABO system. Now, another thing that's important to keep in mind is that the frequencies that are reported in the study may not actually reflect the population frequencies for reasons other than bacterial contamination. So, for instance, there are kinship effects in burial sites, where basically if you're going to a few geographic burial sites and you're just digging up remains and then testing people who are all buried near each other, they're going to be more genetically related to each other than just randomly selected individuals.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right. I remember reading that as well, kind of thing. Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to see, I'm trying to see an asymmetry or a symmetry breaker from saying, like, okay, maybe it is from some environmental, like, bacterial contamination that's equally accounting for these things, or is it because of the kinship distribution factors, and or that they had different blood things? I'm kind of seeing them as equally
Which
probable.
is,
Like,
so
is
in
that
this case,
fair?
we're looking under a microscope. We're not seeing any bacteria, right? So there's no bacterial colony in the vicinity of the samples that we're testing. Then we're going and then we're saying, okay, now in 2 independent substrates, 3 independent sites, we're getting concordant AB results between all of them, right? So we're getting a triple replication across 3 independent sites where we're not seeing any positive evidence of bacteria in any of those sites. And then we're just asking ourselves, okay, based on cases where we just know for a fact and we don't have to conjecture, like in the Israel study, but based on cases where we know for a fact what the true blood type was, and then we go and put it into environmental exposures that are very harsh, what frequency would we expect to get these 3 ABs from those exposures? And basically, that's where I'm saying I think we actually get a very, very low, basically, frequency, even compared to just choosing AB at random. So it's just far less likely than even just the random coincidence of choosing AB that you'd get the triple replication from bacteria. I mean, the additional point is just if you looked at the, what is it, the Peruvian mummies or the Chilean
Yeah,
mummies? Let me check.
Chilean.
Yeah, Chilean mummies, 54 Chilean mummies. Basically, that's actually very much more analogous to the Lanciano case, because in those cases we're dealing with something that's desiccated, right? So there's no moisture, there's not water activity, and so then you don't have enough to sustain like these like gram-negative bacteria colonies.
Maybe this would be a good point to go to the switcheroo hypothesis that Dale outlined in his opening. So Dale, why don't you just rehash what you said, and then we'll get Ethan's response.
Yeah, so basically, my hypothesis in a nutshell is I don't want to attribute fraud to Dr. Linoli. I've tried my best to see his personality. I think there is some evidence to suggest he was an honest broker, and for example, how he treated the WHO fraud, even in his private letter. He's kind of like a Giulio Fonte type. He was very outraged. Get rid of this nonsense. I had nothing to do with it and stuff like that. So I think it is unlikely to say that Linoli was involved or was aware of any kind of fraud. The churchman, on the other hand, is where my hypothesis goes. That I think the friars or whoever was in charge of the samples. Again, I don't know how the Catholic Church hierarchy works in that church and stuff like that, but whoever was had access to the samples, they probably switched out the samples at some point. And this was something they had probably had a track record of doing, going all the way back to 1574 when they first uncontroversial recording of the samples are there. They do the weighings, and then all of a sudden they do another inspection in the 1600s. Maybe a switch happened there. Maybe they're switching it out every 100 years or so. But at the very least, between 1574 and 1886, I argue there had to be a switch to explain why the weights were different. Why were the blood clots all equaling the same? Unless you postulate ad hocly it's a miracle. I don't think that's true, kind of thing. That would just be a meaningless miracle. I think even Ethan would agree on that, hopefully. And then in 1886, we get very specific measurements where one is clearly, it's like 8 grams, I think it is, or something like that. It's clearly different compared to the others, which are 2 grams and 1 gram and stuff like that. So I think there was at least one switch there, providing for the plausibility. And then perhaps there was a switch in the 1800s, in the 1880s, or up until the 1960s kind of thing. And I don't want to get too specific, but I'm thinking the most likely candidate is sometime in the 1960s when they were thinking about doing these scientific tests and that sort of thing. And I'll just very quickly say I provide some evidence, circumstantial evidence, which I think allows for it. So number one, they were aware of problems with the Lanciano miracle in terms of its historical provenance and stuff like that. And so in one of my sources on the Catholic side, they even mentioned that they specifically selected Dr. Lanoli for the purpose of, he's not a hostile source. We need someone who's not just hostile or, neutral or something like that. We want someone who's kind of partial to the Catholic case. And that's why they selected Dr. Lanoli, apparently. Number two, we have the WHO report, where I think it is connected to the churchmen. They had this false report in their vault and that sort of thing. And I know Ethan has a response to that where he says it's not their fault, but I think it was. Number one, they had the 1977 letter from Lanoli himself denouncing this. Why didn't they follow his advice and destroy it then? No, they didn't have. Okay, well, from my understanding, they had it, but Ethan will correct that if that's not true. But here's there was a second. When Franco Serafini went to try to get a copy of this in 2016, he talks about how the churchmen were coming across. He compares them to a mafia boss at one point. I'm not going to go that far. He explains that as just he's an old man, but he had certain concerns which were very odd. If you think this was a proven miracle for transubstantiation, I think you would be very open. Instead, he's saying, I'm very caught. I don't want to give this to you. You can't publish anything that you find about it. He's very trying to control what he can publish or say about it, and that comes across as suspicious. If I've got proof, I sing to the rooftops about the Shroud of Turin because I honestly believe the scientific evidence supports it. So it's just suspicious why they're. And then when Franco gets there, they give him a fake copy of the report and that sort of thing. And they say, well, we don't know if we can trust you. And then eventually they find out, okay, he's a good, faithful Catholic and stuff like that. And then half an hour later, okay, we'll give you the real report and that sort of thing. So those are my reasons. They're circumstantial evidence, but I think they at least support the equal plausibility of these churchmen know more than they're saying, and they're trying to control things a bit. But yeah, Ethan, over to you.
Yeah. Well, so, the first thing that I want to see is just, so there's some data that I think every theory has to explain. And I just want to check to see so let's just concede all the factual premises of the substitution theory. And I don't want to concede those. I'll come back to them later. But let's concede all the factual premises and let's just see how much it helps us deal with the hard data that we want to explain. So The first thing I think would be hard for you. So obviously the main thing we want to explain is the preservation of the relics, right? And so
Yeah.
the thing you're doing is you're wanting to say it's in the 60s, right? Is when the substitution takes place, and that'll make it easier for you in terms of the state of preservation of the relics at the time Dr. Winoli did his study, right?
Mhm.
But the first thing I do want to clarify is, so obviously it's been 50 years and the relics are still there. You can go visit them. You can look at them. What's the deal? Like if I cut out a piece of heart and put it on a table, it's not going to be here in 50 years.
Yeah, and the cases are not airtight, kind of thing, right? So I admit the preservation aspect is, if from trying to explain it from a naturalistic perspective, I think is the most difficult aspect for me, and especially this becomes the case because I think there are indications that the sample wasn't exactly fresh when it was switched out. Right there, for example, there are nail holes in it, suggesting it has some kind of older provenance and stuff. Right, but yeah. So by modern, I'm thinking sometime in the 20th century, maybe late 1800s at the most, kind of thing. But yeah, in terms of the preservation, I guess I would just say when I looked into this, and I tried my best to find credible scientists on the other side who address this, and I know Maxime gives some examples on his end, but I didn't find anything that I was able to latch onto and say, this is what I think is probably the explanation. And that's why I left it out of my opening presentation. But I will say this from what I've seen, there are people who question this, right? So in your debate with Stacy, she was saying, no, this isn't, the preservation isn't necessarily something that's totally unexplainable and stuff, especially if we're talking about a modern switch rather than a pre-modern one and stuff like that. So, and you yourself in your blog, you provide certain things explaining the desiccation and stuff like that, as to why it's dried out. But yeah, so I would just say, like, from my understanding, the experts seem to be mixed, and that's why I'm afraid to take a stance one way or the other on that. But I will admit the preservation is something that I'm looking for a good explanation on, and so far I haven't found it, other than saying, well, scientists say no, Ethan, this can actually happen if you, especially if you're putting it in a container that's relatively sealed, maybe not airtight, but is relatively sealed. That they say this can happen, and if you put beef jerky in a jar, it'll last hundreds of years too. So that's the best I have. I know it's not a good response, but that's the best I was able to find.
Yeah. So basically, and there's one part of the preservation that I do want to talk about, that I did want to talk about just then, which is just there's a preservation that's happened since the study has taken place. And so that seems like something that it's very hard for your theory to accommodate. Another thing that I think is probably going to be difficult for your theory to accommodate is if you're conceding the protein electrophoresis results. If you're conceding those, well, remember the Nizudi, what he's saying is that we shouldn't have gotten these results with 4 days at, like literally like within a week at 4 degrees centigrade, you wouldn't be getting the clean fractionation that you're getting on that test. And meanwhile, I'm showing that if it's a year prior to the breaking of the seals that this took place, or at least a year prior to when the test is conducted, that basically, yeah, I mean, you would have the gamma inflation that we don't observe, that can be used as a dating method for blood serum. But
Okay. Well,
I mean, as you're saying, I get it that you don't have a theory right now to deal with the preservation, so it's okay if you want to reiterate that. But I do just want to clarify that there are deeper layers to the preservation too. So another thing is, actually, this is something that I think people don't appreciate at all. Like, I haven't seen commentary about this in the literature, but to me, it seems like a glaring problem, which is just that, like, okay, with tissue, it makes sense how you can desiccate the tissue and then it will retain structural integrity because there's like a scaffolding, there's like a cellular matrix there to where when you draw out all the moisture, there's still some kind of structure that it can have to where you can preserve the tissue, like what we see with the Lanciano flesh. But when you start thinking about actually blood clots, if you think about it, those entire things are just full of the liquid, right? So what you should get when you basically desiccate the blood clot to avoid the putrefaction of the blood clot is you should get a residue, right? You should get a trace residue. You shouldn't get like a freestanding coagulated mass. And so it's not at all clear. Like if you went to me tomorrow and you said, Ethan, I'm going to give you 100 grand and I want you to spend the next few days brainstorming how are you going to make, just duplicates of the Lanciano blood clots. Like I'm going to tell you keep your money because I'm not going to be able to do it.
Yeah, it like I said, it sounds very intriguing and baffling. Again, for me as a layman with no knowledge on this, I just have no clue. And I was desperate to, when you had your debate with Stacy, I was hoping, okay, is she going to go into the details? And she didn't. She basically just said what I said, that, well, no, it is possible that, this kind of thing could happen, but you guys didn't get into the details. And I tried to reach out to Dr. Kelly Kearse for help, and he didn't get in touch. So I wasn't able to get specific details on that. But okay, I have 2 points about the preservation then. And okay, so the first thing is, why is it, if it is so obvious that it's supernaturally preserved in certain respects, and it's just obvious, like why on God's green earth are people like Stacy, who should know better, why is she saying hesitant and saying no, I think it is possible for it to be preserved and stuff like that? Like, why? And she's Roman Catholic. Why wouldn't she jump on this and say, yes, we do have proof now. Forget about Linoleum. This thing's miraculously preserved, and that's enough to prove it.
Well, and I like Dr. Trasankos, and so no offense to Dr. Trasankos with anything that I say, but basically, I think Dr. Trasankos is especially, and this is something that she actually made clear in her debate, she's especially upset with some of the stuff that's happened with like Castanon Gomez and some of the stuff with the Buenos Aires and the Tixtla. And I think it's kind of left her with a sour taste in her mouth about all Eucharistic miracles, to where she has a suspicion towards just Eucharistic miracles as like a category of phenomena. And so I think she can even look at Lanciano, and I think, if I remember, but it's been so long since I've read it, in her book on Eucharistic miracles, when she's talking about Lanciano, she concedes that basically the exceptional preservation is impressive, right? And she's just very epistemically cautious when it comes to concluding that it's miraculous. And I think she also just has such a bad taste in her mouth when it comes to the whole Eucharistic miracle phenomena, because of what she perceives as some like nefarious hijinks that are happening in, the Buenos Aires case, So, I would be hesitant to give a counterweight. So here's a guy that I want to read his testimony just for us real quick, so we can get a sense of how people feel, how people on the other side. So you're pointing out, oh, here's a Catholic that's not as excited as they should be. Well, I'm going to give you like a paranormal phenomena debunker, like Joe Nickel guy, and we're just going to hear what he has to say. And I think this will be interesting to show that you can get people on both sides of this coming to opposite conclusions here. But here it is. So
this will be fascinating because, Joe, I'm not a fan of Joe Nickel when it comes to the shroud, but so if you're saying he's supporting you, that would
no, it's not Joe Nickel. I'm saying it's that style of guy. But here it is. Okay. So he is named Dr. Silvano Fuso, a member of CICAP, an advocacy group that, quote, promotes critical investigation of the pseudosciences, end quote. And I'm sure you have plenty of experience with people like this with your shroud work. Absolutely. And he says, of course, the preservation of proteins and minerals observed in Lanciano's flesh and blood is neither impossible nor exceptional. Repeated analyses have allowed proteins to be found in 4,000 and 5,000-year-old Egyptian mummies. But it should be emphasized that the case of a body mummified according to known procedures is very different from that of a fragment of myocardium left in its natural state for centuries, exposed to atmospheric physical and biochemical agents. And so basically, what he's conceding there is that he doesn't have a precedent.
Okay. Yeah, touche. I'll let you, all right. My last question on this, and I know you have a response to this because I read it in your blog and that sort of thing, but so obviously something that you mentioned in your opening, but I haven't. So I've been a bad Protestant here, but look, there were scientific tests done by Lannoli that came out negative for blood, namely those two, the Teichmann and what's the what's the other one called? Tacky. How do you say the other one? Oh,
Oh,
okay, that
sorry. It's Teichmann and Takayama.
Takayama. That's it. Yeah. So, and these came out negative for blood, and you have a ready-made explanation for this. It's basically because the samples have decomposed. So we have this mixture of results, kind of thing, right? Where okay, on one end, it's supposedly miraculously preserved, kind of thing, to the point where naturalism can't explain it. But then it also has aspects of natural decomposition happening. So it is a mixed bag. And even though this is kind of a theological objection, I didn't find your response to this in the blog proper. Like, yeah, like give your response first of all, and then I'll say why I don't buy it. But what's your response? Why do we have this mixed bag of decomposition but miraculously preserved?
Yeah. Well, I mean, basically, so if God ever does any miracles related to incorruption, there's basically one option, which is that he's always going to do perfect preservation, right? To where we went over and basically we go dig up the saint's grave, and then we pull up the saint's, casket, and we open it up, and it looks exactly 100% identical to the day they were buried, with no signs of corruption or decomposition. Now, people are willing to recognize that not all incorruption miracles would necessarily have to be that. God could choose to work an incorruption miracle where it was a naturalistically inexplicable degree of preservation that was sending a message, but that also it wasn't so conspicuous that there was no possible room to doubt it or to deny it, or to, basically skeptics had absolutely no room to maneuver. So it's just like, and so for similar reasons, as God doesn't do the thing that like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens demand that he does, which is basically like manifest his existence so conspicuously that it would be psychologically impossible for everyone to deny that he existed. I think all of us actually as Christians are committed, to believing what the Bible says. It's the glory of God to conceal, you know. And that means that basically what God does is he creates a situation where it's rationally obligatory to believe in him. And so you can, through studying the world and inquiring, if you are, to borrow your channel name, a real seeker, you will be able to find the truth about God. But on the other hand, if you're a person who wants to live in denial, right, that's also psychologically possible for you. He's not coercing you. He's not making it impossible for you to live in that state of denial. And I think all Christians are going to have to say that. And so then I don't think it actually should be that surprising to us when we go look at a miracle where we go and we have these like indubitable scientific results proving that there is extraordinary preservation, that God also let there be one or two anomalies, just like little embarrassments. And I think, I mean, in the case of the shroud, obviously you have the ultimate embarrassment in 1988. But I mean, obviously, I like what your guy says, Bob Rucker, but I mean, try explaining that to people. It's
Oh yeah, yeah. The neutron absorption hypothesis. Yeah, it's quite complicated, but believe it or not, I think it works to defeating the 88 carbon 14 dating. But yeah, so in terms of your response, so it is an interesting response. So let me start with where I agree with you that I don't necessarily discredit something as being a miracle of God just because there are mixed results. So you give the example in your blog of, well, Jesus retained wounds in his hands. He wasn't perfectly restored, kind of thing, right? And that sort of thing. So it's not an automatic disproof. But I would argue that the default is for perfect. I mean, for example, when Jesus does miracles healing people, he always does it perfectly. Like they're perfectly healed, and nobody's free will is violated by giving an absolute proof to people and stuff like that. So I don't buy like God's got to be hidden where there has to be some kind of doubts. No, he can commit perfect miracles and in front of people, and Jesus did that in front of the Pharisees. And there's always some way for them to doubt. Oh, that's just the power of Satan or something like that. So I don't. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No. So, and sorry, I do, but I think that's a good point to jump in, which is so I completely agree with you that God is not going to hold to this criteria of preserving the psychological possibility of doubt for all people, right? I don't think he's going to
Okay.
do that. So, for instance, like Our Lady, I don't think, I think it was manifested so clearly to her, and to the
Yeah.
apostles, after Pentecost. I think it's manifested so clearly to them. I mean, sometimes the reason why he actually withholds it is almost so people don't have the maximum culpability that they would have given their present dispositions, basically where they have to have contempt for known truth and just reject it even though it's manifested clearly. So sometimes it's like a mercy that basically people aren't given the full weight of the evidence at a given time, so they don't actually have the pure malice rejection of it, which is why I think there's a different standard when it comes to public evidence versus private evidence. And public
Okay.
evidence in the modern world is different than in our Lord's day. Because for our Lord's miracles, all the evidence except for the people in the immediate vicinity of the miracle was just going to be credible testimony. And obviously, there's always a psychological possibility to doubt credible testimony, right? Now, meanwhile, when it comes to like photographs and videos and battery of scientific tests, and you're looking at it right there it's on all the news stations in the world, the way that you have to preserve plausible deniability looks a little different, than just when everything is going to be attested by word of mouth.
Yeah, I guess. So I take your point about there possibly being a difference in terms of, en masse and public and stuff like that. But I'm still, yeah, I guess I'm still a little bit skeptical. Like in this case, if it wasn't a mixed bag, like God, you've said it yourself, right? Like in terms of the supernatural stuff, right? The preservation, if you're correct. And again, unfortunately I wasn't able to find a good response counter to that I was comfortable adopting in this debate. But let's say it doesn't exist, and you're correct. Like that alone, like who cares if there was no the Teichmann test failed. Like that's not enough to give plausible deniability publicly. If it is so clearly miraculous in the preservation, that evidence is still striking and bold. Richard Dawkins won't be able to refute that. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead, Cam.
Yeah, well, I was going to say we're at about the hour mark for the open dialogue, so we have an opportunity here to either continue the discussion or we can turn to Q&A. I was going to suggest continuing the discussion along the demonic deception route because I think it ties into what Ethan was arguing in his opening statement about preservation and that being like impossible in the demonic hypothesis. So maybe we could continue that discussion maybe for 5-10 minutes and then turn to Q&A. How does that sound?
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Yeah, sure.
Up to Ethan.
I mean, it's almost sad because there was so much more I wanted to get to with substitution, but I guess it's so easy in these conversations to go on forever, So and it's fun talking with you, and you're a great interlocutor. But with the demonic deception hypothesis, yeah. So you say in principle you think demons can do like preservation miracles for like 1,000 years?
Yeah. I don't think there's anything restricting that. So long as God permits them, yeah, they can perform any miracle that God will permit them. I don't think demons are restricted in the types of miracles they can perform.
Oh, well, wait. So, for instance, I mean, just let's go through some examples in the New Testament just to show that there are types of miracles that demons can't perform. And then we can return to whether incorruption is one of those. But just like, so for instance, Nicodemus, one of the faithful speaking to Jesus, says, like, we know that you're from God because, if you weren't from God, like no one who's not from God could do the signs that you're doing, right? And you go and you look at when he heals the blind man says, no one's ever heard of restoring sight to a man born blind. If he was not from God, he could do nothing, right? In response to the Pharisees who are accusing him of breaking the Sabbath, right? And so we see that's clearly the sense of the faithful, that there are limits on the power. It's also not exactly clear why miracles would be convincing proofs, as they're cited in the Bible as being convincing proofs, if basically no, like demons could literally and habitually did in fact do lots of counterfeit miracles that were just completely indistinguishable from Christ's miracles.
Yeah, so taking the last thing first, I think it's absolutely correct that Jesus was remarkable for his miraculous works, specifically exorcisms and healings and that sort of thing. But I think it comes down to the quantity of the miraculous events he did throughout his ministry, and I think that's what most biblical scholars commentate on, kind of thing. So I wouldn't, in terms of specific events and stuff like that, like healing blindness, I mean, or even exorcising fellow demons. The Bible's crystal clear. Actually, demons do have the power to do that, and they will be doing that.
Where does the Bible say that?
I looked at, I forget the verse, but it's in the New Testament where we're being warned. Okay.
Maybe you're thinking of Matthew 24, where it's false signs and wonders.
That as well. There was another one in the epistles somewhere that I was thinking of, but we are warned.
Second
basically,
Thessalonians.
It's the verse where Jesus is like, you're going to say, look at what we did for you, and we got rid of demons. We did all these healings. We did all these miracles, and we did it in your name. And then Jesus is going to say, get out of my face. I never knew you, type thing.
Yeah, but that's not demons. That's not demons. That's reprobate working miracles in the name of Christ. So those are genuine miracles, but just showing the fact that you're a miracle worker doesn't mean your salvation is assured. That's what's being taught in that context.
So you think that they're miracles actions done by God in support of false teachers? Like, not in support.
They're not false teachers. They're invoking the name of Christ. So people can have false views, right? But they would become a false prophet if they claimed to be a divine legate, to where they were speaking in the name of God, right? To where they were saying, God wants you all to believe this. And to demonstrate that, I call upon God to perform this sign, right? That God is never going to cooperate with people doing that. However, what I do believe is that there are lots of people who are not going to be elect, right? Who nonetheless God will have worked mighty signs and wonders through them that would be genuine miracles. So just the fact that you're a miracle worker, the fact that God uses you to do works, he uses you as an instrument, doesn't mean that your salvation is assured.
Okay. So let me not go down that road then, and let me just say, I'm still skeptical about limiting demons' power. I don't see, you appeal to Nicodemus.
If it was about quantities and the blind. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, one last thing, because you also mentioned Nicodemus, and I promise I'll let you respond to. But again, this is cool. That's what Nicodemus thought, but Nicodemus was wrong. Like that, Nicodemus saying it doesn't make it true. The Bible's just accurately, under inspiration, recording what Nicodemus taught. It doesn't necessarily verify. So if you have independent reasons to verify and what Nicodemus thought this was actually true, then that would solve the issue. Like, yeah, do you have anything to say Nicodemus was right when he said that?
Well, yeah, so it's obviously so first I think it's very it's problematic exegesis to find in the signs gospel of John when he's portraying someone favorably, where he's showing what the sense of the faithful is in reaction to Jesus's signs and contrasting that with the Pharisees, the faithless Pharisees, right? So Nicodemus, the teacher of the law, is the one coming, and rather than with all the other Pharisees being like, oh, he's forgiving sins, he's breaking the Sabbath, he's blaspheming, rather than being like them, he's saying, look, I know you're from God, because if you weren't from God, you couldn't do these signs, right? And so the author, the evangelist, St. John the Evangelist, is commending Nicodemus to us because he's making a confession of faith in the Gospels, right? Okay. So that's a confession of faith by the faithful that we're clearly being shown that that's a good way of reasoning in contrast to the Pharisees, where that's a bad way of reasoning, right? But I think it's clearer too, where it's like in the man born blind case, he's being commended by Jesus right after this exchange that he has with the Pharisees, where they're investigating the miracle that Jesus did, right? And the man born blind, if your reading were correct, where it was just about the sheer quantity of miracles, he shouldn't have said, oh, well, if he wasn't from God, he could do nothing. He should have said, oh, if he wasn't from God, he couldn't do so much.
Yeah, well, I think so. This is trying to say like demons in them of themselves don't have the power to do it unless it's permitted to them by God. I mean, yeah, like Satan and demons have immense powers. I mean, even in the modern day, look at Craig Keener's testimony about some of his experiences attributed to demons, like knocking over a tree. Would you say that they don't have the power to knock over a tree, kind of thing? Well,
So
apparently
that's
they
obviously
do.
something. Yeah, within our theology, like of course we believe demons can obviously do local motion, right? So like apparitions, local motion, all those things are things that demons can do. Lots of aerial prodigies that they could do. So a lot of stuff related to UAPs. That's totally within bounds for demons. But
I
but
was
the
yeah,
the
I was gonna.
problem
That
the
was one of my
problem starts.
questions for you.
Yeah, the problem
Sorry.
starts to become when you start attributing boundless powers to the demons. Because the thing is, God is not going to work through demons to do anything that exceeds the natural power of the demon, right? So the demon wouldn't be able to do anything if God didn't permit it to exercise its natural power. However, God is not going to actually actively cooperate with the demon to basically perform a work through the demon that exceeds the demon's natural power. Um, and so then it becomes a relevant question: what are the limits on the natural power of demons? So, for instance, in Isaiah 48, we learn that demons don't have determinate foreknowledge of the future, unlike God, and that this is actually
Right.
something that we can use to tell whether a prophecy is from God or not from God. And so that's just an example of a limit on demonic power that we're supposed to use to discern whether something is from God or whether it's diabolical.
Yeah. Your last example is a good example. So yeah, I would agree with that. That's a God, something that God will not permit or allocate to them. But yeah, and in terms of Nicodemus, last thing I'll just say on that, again, he's talking about the signs cumulatively, right? Like he's fulfilling all of these signs that are consistent with messianic prophecy about the messianic mission. I still wouldn't say, well, in any individual instance, like, oh, that means the demon is naturally limited to healing blind people. Like he can turn water into blood, but he can't turn in the Exodus, right? There are some of the supernatural signs that they're able to replicate or something like that, but they can't heal a blind man or something like that. I don't see any reason to limit that, but this isn't necessarily a biblical debate. So what do you make of my arguments? Because I actually gave so for example, Dr. Linoli's findings, and you reported this, that the proteins are in this normal distribution, and they seem to be preserved as though they're fresh serum. But that contradicts, if my understanding of transubstantiation is correct, it's this representing of Jesus in the moment of his sacrificial death on the cross. And if that's the case, his blood should be in the state it was when he was on the cross. But clearly in Lanciano, it's not. It's too good, as you've made the case here today, and it shouldn't be. Modern medical knowledge says it shouldn't be this good. And in fact, if we accept the Shroud of Turin, there have been studies on the bloodstains, and guess what? It's inconsistent with Lanciano. Those bloodstains do evidence there's some kind of torture that the person went under and stuff. So that's a first sign that maybe this is Lanciano's a satanic trick. It's close, but no cigar in terms of the true transubstantiation doctrine.
Yeah, well, so I mean, I think a lot of this just will actually have to do with clarifying Catholic Eucharistic theology. So the
Okay.
first thing that we're saying is when we say that Christ is substantially present in the consecrated species, we're not affirming that that's the same kind of basically presence that you or I have in this room right now, or the table has in this room right now. It's actually like a special mode of presence that it doesn't play by the same rules. And we can go through some of the asymmetries between the two, but actually might get us a little bit beyond the scope if we actually start going and explaining all this scholastic stuff. So, but what I'll focus on is just that we don't think that it's, and basically just every single time the priest says the words of consecration, it's a valid formula, valid minister. We believe that Christ becomes basically substantially present, and the accidents only like aptitudinally inhere, rather than actually inhering in a substance like the substance of bread. Now, but that doesn't manifest itself as there's perceptible, observable, Jesus blood in the room in the ordinary case, right? And so in the extraordinary case, what's happening is not that the actual accidents of our Lord in his glorified body in heaven right now, it's not that those are becoming basically physically present to us in exactly the same way as like my arm or my leg is physically present to us. There's a substantial presence that it has, and then there's accidents that are signifiers of it. So they are signs that represent it. That's what happens in the Eucharistic miracle case. So it's in the same way that when you're familiar with like a stigmatist, right? Where they have wounds that represent the passion wounds of Christ. So they're supernatural wounds that represent. So, and that's what's actually happening in this case, is that there's accidents of blood that represent basically Christ's blood and that represent Christ's flesh. And that those are the accidents that become perceptible after the Eucharistic miracle has taken place. And so that doesn't mean that they need to actually be. Now, another point of confusion, last thing before I'll stop talking for a minute, but another point of confusion is that we're not saying that it's Christ's blood on Calvary that would be present. The thing that's, more properly we would say is it's the glorified body in heaven that's substantially present. So it actually wouldn't be problematic at all for there to be a discordance between that and the shroud. But in either case, it's not literally the blood of our Lord's glorified body in heaven. It's a representation of it.
Okay. So fair enough. I will need to confirm what the doctrine is saying. So I was getting that from Dr. Louis Dizon and Michael Lofton. So I was just kind of taking what they taught about this in order to avoid. It's not a re-sacrifice; it's a re-presenting. So it's almost like, 30 AD is here present. So it's almost like you are getting Jesus.
Just to clarify that, so there's no confusion, we definitely teach that it's a representation of Christ's sacrifice on Calvary. But making present the sacrifice, that's not actually referring to Christ's physical body on Calvary. So those two things are different. So there's the sacrifice, which is actually like the meritorious act that covers sin, right? That's the efficient cause of the remission of sins and of all these graces and praise and thanksgiving and stuff like that. So basically we think about that, think about the sacrifice as basically like this like moral currency. I'm being a little loose, but think about it as like a moral currency that it's this big bag of moral money that is Christ's sacrifice. And basically when you're representing it, it's almost as if like we're taking out a withdrawal.
Okay, fair enough. So I tell you what, I will withdraw that argument until I can clarify the Catholic doctrine, make sure I have a proper understanding. But last argument. Oh, okay.
If you have one more, let's do that.
Just one more. So this was important for me. So remember, I said there was no DNA studies. In order to have a substantive change, you have to. I think that the DNA, physical DNA, is part of the essence of the human nature. So, insofar as the human nature, Jesus' blood and body is present, that we should have DNA studies. We should have DNA, human DNA there. Now, we haven't disconfirmed there's DNA. We haven't confirmed it. There have been no tests to prove whether human DNA is present with Lanciano. And my argument is, well, that leaves us with a gap. That leaves us with, okay, the purpose of the miracle is really just to falsify Protestantism. Anyone who denies basic transubstantiation, but it doesn't help us discern. Should I be an Orthodox? Should I join the Assyrian Church of the East? Should I be a Catholic? It's not specific enough without, proving certain elements that are distinctive or vindicative, as you say, for Roman Catholicism specifically. So that goes against God's MO. When he uses miracles, he uses them to positively authenticate, not just to falsify something and say, yeah, Protestantism is bad. As to what's good, you guys figure out between the rest. So it's against his MO, and I'll let you respond, and that'll be it.
Well, in this case, I think clearly Lanciano wasn't about falsifying Protestantism, because Protestantism didn't exist in the 8th century when the Lanciano miracle took place. There was a priest who had doubts about basically the real presence in the Eucharist. And it seems like the principal intention, like in the immediate context, was to basically confirm this priest in his faith in the real presence. So that's positively authenticating a doctrine. Now, I don't think it's true, and I don't think it's actually consistent with God's MO, as I understand it, that every single miracle is going to tell you every single doctrinal truth. Like, I don't think there's almost any miracles I'm aware of that there's very few that do that, you know. Maybe you could count the resurrection like a foundational miracle, you know.
Okay. I promise. I know Cameron's trying to get in it, so I promise you the last word. But like, yeah, there are a couple things I would want to come back on. So maybe I'll just ask you by email or something.
Or Cameron, do you want to let him go?
No, yeah, feel free. Yeah, feel free to continue going. We've got a couple super chats that have come in, but as they start to accumulate, which we don't have a ton right now, so we're good. You guys can keep going.
Okay. Yeah. So very briefly. So in terms of God always uses miracles in a positive way. Not necessarily. I'm not saying he has to authenticate every doctrine. Obviously, that's impossible, right? Like the resurrection doesn't authenticate Jesus' divinity in a direct way or something like that. But I'm just saying it serves to authenticate some kind of doctrine. And if it's meant to be, if the purpose of it is to say, yeah, in this case for our debate, basic transubstantiation is true, or Roman Catholic transubstantiation is true, right? Your specific aspects, which differ between the Orthodox and the Syrian Church of the East. Jesus would do a miracle that authenticates and identifies, yeah, I want you to be Catholic, kind of thing, right? Specifically. And if all we've proven is basic transubstantiation, that doesn't get us to Catholic. It just says, well, anyone who denies transubstantiation, that's Protestants, they're wrong, kind of thing. And that's against his MO. So that's what I mean there. It's authenticating a specific doctrine. And the second point, and I'll let you speak, the content, trying to attach this event to the context of the legend of Lanciano is meaningless, because we can't historically establish there's any connection between what Dr. Linoli studied in his thing, which is giving us the evidence for something supernaturals here, to what happened there. There's no direct historical evidence to link it there. So it's too loose of a connection. It's not what I would call sufficiently attached to that. So you can't use that as a Catholic specific authenticating context. But yeah, over to you.
So yeah, Ethan, let's get your final response.
Yeah. Well, so first is, I would say, especially if we're conceding that it is a miracle and that God is going out of his way over 1,500 years to preserve the relics, right? And he created the relics with properties that were optimized for scientific verification, then actually I think it's kind of absurd to deny that God didn't care about preserving the tradition that contextualizes the relics and that gives them their meaning alongside all of these extraordinary deeds. So I think it just actually it begs the question of the whole debate that we're having about authenticity to try to discount the tradition. I mean, also, I did point out in my opening that I do think that there's independent corroboration of the traditional account. Like, for instance, it was written down in these basically Greek-Latin manuscripts that would have been appropriate for basically the authentic document and would have been impractical and kind of pointless for a forger to have forged, and that basically correspond nicely to the basically 10th or the 11th century reference that we have to episcopal records that were created at the time of the miracle that's described in the 11th century reference to the Italy, both species transform and the relics are perpetually venerated. Now, I just simply disagree on both principle and application for the test that you're applying here. So as for principle, I think if you just looked at Matthew 9 with Jesus healing the paralytic, so you may see that man has, or so you may know that man has authority to forgive sins, stand up and walk. So he's confirming just one doctrine, right? That the Son of Man has the authority to forgive sins and that man can have the authority to forgive sins. And then he's just doing a miracle where you wouldn't be able to deduce anything about whether sola fide was true. You wouldn't be able to deduce anything about whether the papacy was true or false, or, apostolic succession or anything just from that sign itself. But the sign in the context was just to confirm one doctrine. And in this case, it's to confirm the real presence. Now, the second thing is, just as I argued in my opening, I actually do think once you view Lanciano as part of a broader pattern of Eucharistic miracles, where all the ones that are scientifically verifiable are occurring in Catholic contexts and not in Lutheran context or Anglican context or Eastern Orthodox context, but specifically in Catholic context repeatedly, you start to get a picture where it actually does start to look like God pointing to the Catholic Church, like fingering us as the guys.
All right, let's wrap the debate there. I know that you guys could continue going on, but we do need to stop at some point. And hopefully we can continue the dialogue via email or some other way, or maybe do like a part 2. Just let me know in the comments if you guys would like to see them back together. But Dale, it's been great to have you so far. So quite a different experience than the last debate that Ethan was in. I thought this was very charitable and very calm and collected, and minor interruptions. So it was really good. So let's turn now to some questions or comments from you guys. This one from Mr. Keeps On Ticking. He says, reading Ethan's article after watching the debate gave me the last nudge I needed to go back to confession yesterday and come back to the church. Started praying the rosary. Keep up doing the great work. God bless you.
That's the best possible thing we can hear. Praise God.
Amen. All right. Carlos the Catholic says, keep up the good work. Appreciate it. All right, here's our first question from Sky Knight for Dale. Accepting Lord's healings, but not the apparition, is like accepting the resurrection, but not Jesus' healings, but denying his authority and divinity. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so in the first place, I said that when it comes to the miraculous healings, I do think there's something special about the sight of Lourdes, where some actual supernatural events, and I would concur, they're miracles of God. But I think healings serve as miracles of outside of the gospel healings, which are attached to Jesus's religious message. God will heal anyone and stuff like that, whether they're atheist or not. So I think he does miracle healings as miracles of compassion. I have a disagreement with Caleb Jackson, who Cameron, I know you know Caleb there and stuff. He's arguing the opposite. He says no, they can be used to authenticate Christianity, and we've had sort of our debates there, but in terms of the historical context, so I would question the historical origin. So from what I remember about Lourdes, it was actually a fairy, not Mary, that they saw originally. So it had pagan origins, if I'm remembering the origin of that one properly. So is that correct, or am I remembering something else? Is that no? Okay.
That's not accurate.
Okay. So yeah, I don't remember the historical origins of Lourdes then, but I would need to look into the historical evidence and see, can I establish there's a sufficient attachment that would serve to authenticate Catholicism there, and that it's sufficiently attached to the miracle healings themselves.
Yeah, and Ethan, feel free to comment on that. This was our last super chat, so unless any more come in, we'll start to wrap up soon.
Yeah, well, I think it's also just, there's a lot of points you can make about Lourdes, and I will make more of them when I publish my post about it. But one of the points that I think we should just make is just like the number of extraordinary, naturalistically inexplicable healings that God is performing in connection with this site, which either, is it the site of where there was this schizophrenic girl, or someone had a diabolical apparition, or whatever you have to say to dismiss it. But for some reason, God has chosen to single that out as a place where there's lots of people all over the world begging for healing miracles. But for some reason, he does lots of them in connection with the Lord's healing water, with a bunch of religious mystical experiences that have content that ties them back to Lourdes, and to do it in just these like incredible ways and in such verifiable ways that are associated with, also what I take to be extremely credible and hard to naturalistically explain apparitions. And this Saint Bernadette, she demonstrates heroic virtue throughout her life, and then also happens to have a very impressive incorrupt body. So I think when we start looking at that pattern of facts, and then we start seeing just the uniqueness and the singularity of Lourdes, to dismiss the content of the apparitions, which are the thing that basically initiate all of this, and around which all of this is framed. Yeah, it does seem to me it's like basically like, maybe I would almost invert what the super chatter said, which is it's almost like accepting every single thing that Jesus did except the resurrection. Like the foundational thing is the thing that you're rejecting, and it's all of the accompanying stuff that points to it and authenticates it. That's what you're accepting.
Dale, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess I would just say so. I'm very skeptical that, like, again, I would need to look into the origin accounts and whether I can actually establish an attachment to the miracle events themselves. And also, I don't accept the quantity of miracles that maybe Ethan is. I only think there are a handful that I think, yeah, this is a miracle of God that I can say probably happened. But the other thing is, I want to say is the mere location that a miracle takes place, or I don't think that's strong enough to set up a sufficient attachment. So I know you mentioned Eucharistic miracles. Well, all the scientific testing takes place in Catholic stuff, or with the Shroud of Turin. Some people have said, well, it's clearly Catholic, but well, no, I could say the Shroud supports Eastern Orthodoxy. Most of its history, it was in the Byzantine lands or in the East, depending on your historical hypothesis there for it. So I don't think mere location or setting of miraculous events in and of itself is enough to establish this, what I'm looking for, this sufficient attachment to an authenticating context. So yeah.
All right, let's leave things there. I appreciate both of you guys coming on and doing this debate. It's been really fun. One last time, just wanted to mention everyone, we are going to do an after show immediately after this live stream ends. You can find that if you're a channel member, you'll have access. It's also linked in the description of this video. It's available to all members, and this is going to also be available if you're watching this debate in the future. You can just click the link in the description and go straight there. It'll be me and Ethan. We're going to kind of break down the content of the debate and just have a good time chatting with members. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching. Thanks to both debaters, Ethan and Dale. And hopefully you guys will go and subscribe to their work. Ethan is on Substack and Dale is on YouTube at Real Seekers. So go check them out. All right. And thanks again. We'll see you guys.